If you would have asked me 5 years ago what the on-trend brewing thing would be in 2021, I never would have guessed that hard seltzer water would be so popular. Laugh all you want, but hard seltzer is a fantastic day drinker and likely isn't going anywhere in the near future. Imperial Yeast's new seasonal strain, W04 Paramount, can help brewers get the most out of their seltzer fermentations. A clean and aggressive fermenter, Paramount will produce an excellent seltzer with low fusel alcohols, and it's produced in a gluten-free medium. If you've tried making seltzer with standard ale or lager strains, you know the struggle, and Imperial Yeast is here to help with W04 Paramount. Check it out at imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. Malt is often described as the backbone of beer, with hops and yeast characteristics often making up the primary flavor components of beer. But malt is a huge portion of the recipe of any beer. From a weight perspective, it's the largest ingredient in beer. So why then does malt seem to play a backseat role? Or does it actually play a backseat role? I'm your host, Cade Job, and today I'm back in the lab with my co-host, Jordan Folks, as we apply the science from last week's episode where I talked with Cecile Chenot about malt as a potential source for releasing bound thiols to improve the flavor of beer.
I really love malt, and I love, good malty beers, but even a really dry, hoppy beer, there's malt back there. And I think that this episode that you did last week, where we're talking about how to get thiols, exposed into your beverage via malt, is a fascinating example of all the crazy things that malt can do that some of us might be taking for granted.
Yeah, right. I mean, even that phrase, like malt is the backbone of beer, right? It's certainly, in terms of my beer consumption, I generally prefer malt forward beers. I mean, I think we've talked about that on the show before, and don't get me wrong, I love hops. I mean, it's what I'm researching here for my PhD now, but I often find myself reaching for a Helles instead of a Pilsner, right? And those aren't necessarily like super hoppy or super malty beers, but it's just kind of an example. To me, the key difference in those is like bitterness and noble hop aroma in the Pils, while malt sort of plays the star role in the Helles. But it's nuanced, and you still have to get that malt flavor to sing, even in the Pils. Because if the malt flavor is messed up in the Pils just doesn't taste right. So, in thinking about like how do you get thiol flavor from malt into beer, and thinking about how like wort is primarily made from malt, it's not just a source of fermentable sugars. If we want to get malt flavors, or rather, let me back up. One of the reasons why we use malt is so that we can have malt flavor in the beer. If we just wanted it as a sugar source, we'd use 100% corn sugar, something that's easier for yeast to assimilate. But we don't. We like malt flavor. If it's the backbone of beer, how do we maximize its flavor contribution? So, of course, Jordan, you and I were talking about it, and that's what we decided to talk about for this episode. We'll share our tips and tricks about how to hit that malt flavor profile, and hopefully share some things with you and talk a little bit also about maybe the potential for releasing bound thiols, which would be a pretty cool new addition to malt flavor. But first, if you're not already a patron of Brülosophy, it would be really cool if you take a minute to support us. Go to patreon.com/Brülosophy and you can choose your monthly contribution level and check out all of the awesome rewards like unpublished contributor recipes, discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session. It's only a few bucks a month and it helps us continue to do what we're doing here at Brülosophy. So now's the time. The great thing, of course, about podcasts is that you can pause them and come back whenever. So please take a minute, pause the show, head over to patreon.com/Brülosophy to sign up. We've got such an active group of Brülosophy followers, whether it's on the website or YouTube channel, through Patreon, people who email in feedback, folks who share and discuss our results on Facebook. It's rewarding and humbling to hear from you all. So I just wanted to say thank you for engaging with us. If you haven't yet left us a comment or review or sent in an email, I'd love to hear from you. Shoot me an email to Cade@Brülosophy.com or leave a comment or review of the show wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. Another great way to support us, of course, is by using those links at Brülosophy.com/support. There's some really cool affiliates who give us a small kickback if you purchase from their site by using one of Brülosophy's links. It doesn't change any part of your shopping experience, but it does help us out. So head over to Brülosophy.com/support to check it out. For feedback this week, we've got listener Scott, who wrote in a few weeks back in episode 72, where he wrote in about hop creep and asked about limit dextranase in hops, and also gave an anecdote about dry hopping and seeing hop creep in beer that was ultimately flagged as having diacetyl at a competition. So I asked him what he does to avoid hop creep, and here's what he said. He says, "Hi, Cade. Thank you for addressing my comment on one of the recent episodes. To answer your question about what I do to reduce hop creep, I've used a number of techniques, including longer fermentation before dry hopping before terminal, dry hop cold after terminal, dry hopping warm at 68 Fahrenheit, etc., and now more recently using ALDC with one of the aforementioned techniques. So far, no diacetyl. At the end of the day, it's the tincture of time that keeps diacetyl at bay. Keep up the tremendous work."
Well, it sounds like they've tried everything, and I can't help but love the fact that ALDC rounds out that list. As far as, bang for your buck, it really is my favorite way to combat dry hop creep lately. I'm curious, what about in the lab, in the work that you guys are doing? Do you guys have a vial of ALDC, milling around that you can add to your test brews?
Yeah, it depends on what yeast strain we're using for the most part. But yeah, we in our test brews, we usually just crash everything and get it off of the hops quickly, right? So we are waiting for diacetyl to be done and to be taken care of, but we usually dry hop and only have the hops in contact with the beer for about 48 hours, and then we do everything that we can to get the hops off of the beer. And so that's usually when we're looking to be done. If diacetyl seems to be a problem, like with some strains, for example, then we'll add some ALDC. But given your experience and given Scott's experience and some of the other people we've talked to, and Ben Edmonds at Breakside and other brewers that I've talked to about this, I'm wondering if maybe ALDC is something we should start to put into our beers, our research beers, just so that we don't have to deal with it. Because again, we're making a lot of single hop IPA beers, studying hops, and so yeah, we're dry hopping almost all the time, and so it seems like it would help us out a lot. But yeah, that's interesting. And Scott, thank you for sending in the original feedback and then also letting us know what techniques you do to help avoid hop creep. All right, after this short break, we'll be back talking about getting flavor from malt. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brülosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
Okay, it's official. We are very much in the final sprint to Election Day. And face it, between debates, polling releases, even court appearances, it can feel exhausting, even impossible to keep up with. I'm Brad Milkey. I'm the host of Start Here, the daily podcast from ABC News. And every morning, my team and I get you caught up on the day's news in a quick, straightforward way that's easy to understand, with just enough context so you can listen, get it, and go on with your day. So, kickstart your morning. Start smart with Start Here and ABC News, because staying informed shouldn't feel overwhelming.
The mighty and resilient Merrimack River, carving through the communities of our great region. My name is Linda Lorden, proud president of Merrimack County Savings Bank. And like the river that serves as our namesake, we're a constant yet ever-changing presence. Because to us, it's bigger than banking. It's about powering communities and putting people first. It's about knowing where you came from and where you're going. That's Merrimack style. Visit us at themerrimack.com.
Somewhere in the annals of brewing lore, someone coined the phrase, brewers make wort, yeast makes beer. While this is true, the conditions of the wort determine the kind of beer that the yeast makes. And sometimes malt is a supporting character in styles where hops or yeast are the star of the show, but malt also shines on its own in certain styles, right, Jordan?
Yeah, there are certainly a variety of styles that are really malt forward. And maybe before we kind of get into some of our tips and tricks for how we want to really drive malt character into beers, we can kind of cover some core malty styles. So before, I thought that maybe we could break it down to kind of by like color gradient. But before we do, I'm curious, overall, what do you think is the maltiest style in beer today?
Oh man, that's a really good question. What is the maltiest style? Some part of me wants to say that like a thick like Scottish ale is like the maltiest, right? Because it's got so much malt character in it, and I don't think it has any hop character. At least if there's hop character, it is very low and maybe just slightly bitter to just offset that cloying sweetness a little bit. But you know, I mean, but you say that, and then like you've got to think about something like a Guinness, right? Or like a porter. I mean, those things are just like all kinds of malt character and they shine. But I am a light lager fan. I've said it a whole bunch of times, and it's not just American light lager. I love the Helles. I love that light German beer too, and the malt just shines in that. I mean, if you wanted to do it just like in terms of ingredients, Helles might be the most malty because there's just not a lot else in there, right? It's just those nice light German kilned malts. I don't know. What do you think is the maltiest?
I would say probably Doppelbock or a big barley wine.
Oh, a big barley wine. That's a good choice.
But, you know, Helles is such a great answer because it's actually drinkable, you know? Like, I love barley wine, I love Doppelbock, but I can't drink a half liter of either of those styles, right? And the Helles is such a great example of a light colored malty beer and also light in alcohol. You know, that's like 4.8% ABV, very little SRM, but malt for days. And I think that what we're exposing here is there's a variety of, you know, kind of levers we can pull, be it water chemistry, attenuation, ingredient choice, strength. And collectively, Helles is maybe the simplest of these examples, you know, not that high of an OG, standard finishing gravity, you know, pretty simple water profile, maybe 1-to-1, maybe 2-to-1 in terms of chloride to gypsum. What do you think? Are there any other important light malty styles that we should note here?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is that time of the year, right? We have to mention the Fest beer. I mean, this, you know, September Fest, that's another one of those light styles that I love, that are just light and malty. You know, of course, the Pilsner Urquell. I think that's another great, malty style. It's not necessarily a Helles. I mean, it's got a little bit more hop character to it. You know, I don't know that I would necessarily call it a German Pils, right? Because a German Pils is going to be a little more bitter and a little bit more hoppy. But, you know, it really, and I love starting here talking about styles because it really does showcase the range of malt, right? Mm-hmm. Because you said like we can break this down into into colors, right? Color we don't generally associate with flavor, right? I mean, maybe we actually do that in our brain, but color doesn't usually, like, you know, whether it's light or dark. There's been experiments that Marshall's shown that, right? Like you can put food coloring, you can put a Cinnamar in beer in a Helles and convince people that it tastes different when it really doesn't taste any different.
Right. Well, there was that famous study, right, with the red wine and the white wine, and they just dosed white wine with red food coloring, and, you know, wine experts were giving tasting notes for a red wine.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But I mean, you know, from our perception, there's really not a whole lot of flavor difference. We could kind of convince ourselves that color, plays a role. But it is because, I mean, the way that we make malt gives us such a variety. I mean, we have these light malts that we use to make Helleses, the base malts, but then you've got a range. You can go anywhere with malt. You can go into caramel malts. You can go into roasted malts. You can go into kilned malts, you know, more heavily kilned malts like the biscuits and browns and all those ranges, and then get over into the dark stuff, you know, like fully roasted chocolate or white chocolate or pale chocolate or roasted barley or midnight wheat, you know, when we're talking, well, that's a wheat, not necessarily a barley malt. But there's just such a range. And Helles and Festbier, I think, are my favorite light ones. But what I mentioned earlier, those dark ones, like Guinness is one of the most popular beers in the world, right? And that is almost entirely a malty beer, right? It's got a mostly, and the funny thing too there is that it's like what, 95% Pilsner malt and 5% roasted barley. I think that's like the traditional Guinness recipe, right?
Something like that. Yeah, I remember that 95.5. But what's funny about that beer is it's dry and it's fairly low ABV. And so you'll hear, people that don't know much about beer will complain, oh, Guinness, I just get so full on Guinness, which is kind of a misnomer, right?
Yeah.
Because it's such a light beer, actually. And to me, personally, it doesn't strike me as a particularly malty beer. And I think it's because of how dry it is and like how clean it is on your palate, even though clearly there's a roast character. I don't know. I guess I don't really associate that with like malt in the same way that I do with something like a Doppelbock, which is just like malt in your face, or maybe a maltier dark beer like a big barrel-aged imperial stout where you're getting tons of malt for days, or a black barley wine, or even just an American stout. But those Irish stouts to me don't come off super malty just because this like mental trick that dryness has on the tongue.
Yeah, and that's something I want to talk more about, and we will later on in the show whenever we talk about like process techniques. But like the concept of a dry malty beer versus a sweet malty beer, right? I mean, I mentioned like what's the maltiest beer? Well, if I'm thinking about like malt flavor, those Scottish ales, those like, what are the 60, 80, 100 shilling ales that are just like super dense and super cloying and super caramely and sweet and thick, and really just don't show anything. I mean, like there's not a lot of yeast character that's in there. There's not a lot of hop character. It's just a really thick malty beer. There might be a little bit of bitterness, and that's kind of, I think, what you're going for in that like high ABV barley wine too, right? Is that same, like you're just getting all kinds of malty sweetness, and you've got such a range. I think malt really, it can be the star of the show in a whole bunch of different beers, and so it's important to get malt flavors where you want them. But malt is also nice in combo with other characteristics. I mean, like one of the things you mentioned was a Doppelbock, right? I think Dunkels and Dunkelweisses are really good examples of like darker beers, right? Dunkel's a dark lager, but Dunkelweiss is, I like to think of it as banana caramel beer, And I mean, it's still like a sweet, I would consider it a malty beer, even though it's wheat and it's, it's got a yeast in it that's POF positive, so it's, but it's dark. I would still consider that kind of a malty beer, even though it's in conjunction with those yeast. A double, right? A Belgian double, that's a malty beer to me too. A Belgian triple, also a malty beer, even though I think the yeast is sort of taking prominence in those particular styles too, because the yeast plays such a big role in those. Yeah,
unless we not forget the quad, maybe the maltiest of the Belgian styles. But, one thing that we're talking about here is these beers seem to kind of be skewing higher ABV. And it's making me think that maybe it's challenging to make a super malty, low ABV beer. Look at Bud Light, German light beer. They're not that malty. But what about English mild? Because that's low ABV and that's like all malt, right?
Yeah, totally. And I've only ever had one true English mild, like in Europe. Otherwise, I've had it like imported here in the United States, and who knows if that was actually a good representation, because you're right. It's low ABV. It's like 3.6 often or lower that they're like targeting, which is a great alcohol level. Gosh, as I get older, I just find myself really liking that level of alcohol because it's just enough for like the flavor and the characteristics, but I don't get hungover the next day, and I can drink a boatload of them, and I don't have to worry about it, which is fantastic. That's a great example of a malty beer, and it exposes, to your point, I think it exposes one of the key things here that we talk about as homebrewers, right? A lot of homebrewers think about malt as, okay, what malt am I supposed to have in order to hit a specific style? And then they think, okay, what's my OG going to be? And that determines how much of that malt I'm going to use, right? And I think that's where, you can end right there. That's fine. You can make great beer doing that. And you still need to think about your OG. But the flavor is a huge role and plays a big deal. That English mild is going to be a very low OG beer, but if you just dump a bunch of water or something. Or let me back this up. An English mild is not watery to me. Is it to you? I mean, it's low ABV, but I've never tasted a watery version.
No, it's a very malty yet sessionable beer. And do you know, what is the average finishing gravity for those? What would the spec be there?
Oh, I have no idea, but I've got to imagine. Oh, my Cicerone test is gonna come back and bite me here. No, I don't know, but I would guess it's still probably like 10, 12, 10, 15, but probably a start from like 10, 30. Because I mean, you're gonna need some residual sweetness, or well, maybe you don't need residual sugar. You're going to need something there that's going to provide body for the beer and give it that malt flavor, but you don't want to just have so much sugar there that the yeast is going to be able to rip through it. So yeah, I actually don't know what the starting OG and FG is for that beer.
Well, according to BJCP, and I have an older app, I think this is 2015 guidelines, dark mild is 1030 to 1038 starting, ending at 1008 to 1013, resulting in an ABV of 3.0 to 3.8. And that's pretty crazy to end that, quote, high when you're starting that low. You know, that's where you're trying to finish a normal like IPA or something that you start at like 1070. So that really exposes this kind of like, relatively speaking, how much body these beers provide. But what I think this exposes is body malty? Is malty body? Or are these kind of like related but technically different things? And so maybe we as brewers and drinkers tend to conflate the two. What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree with you there too. I think especially the earlier you are in your brewing, the less that you know about how beer is made. I certainly think that people think like, oh, thick, oh, that means it's more malty. It's more thicker. Oh, it's more malty. Maybe. And I think there is a component there but this is a part of malt flavor in general, right? I think when you look at like getting malt flavor from beer, it's not just one thing. And I think that, to your point, original point, is I think that's what makes malt challenging, right? You can't say it is just body. No, because then there's things like biscuit and cracker and coffee and sweet and these flavors that we love to get out of it. It's not just flavor, because there's an alcohol component, right? It is the source of sugar that yeast uses to make beer. So that's a piece of it. There's different malt characteristics. There's enzyme packages. There's different mashing procedures. There's boiling techniques. There's the amount of hops and stuff that you use to offset and balance. There are so many things to play with whenever it comes to malt that I think, you have to understand. You have to have an understanding of all of it, painting the entire portrait before you can, really start to do what you want with malt.
Right. And so I think that collectively you got to look at your process and your ingredients. And obviously you need to have some sort of end goal in mind, because the types of malts and heck, the types of processes that we'd use for a sweet stout are going to be different from a Helles. I mean, heck, your processes and ingredients for a sweet stout are going to be different than a barrel-aged imperial stout. And so you really got to think about, am I targeting biscuit or am I targeting roast or, yada, 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 and then start to dial in your recipe and your processes accordingly.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I don't know if you've seen it, but Draft Lab has put out these different flavor maps, which are pretty cool. They've got a malt one, they've got a hop one. I don't think they have a yeast one, at least not yet, as far as I'm aware. But when you look at a malt flavor map, the reason I know about these is because we use these whenever we're doing sensory testing at Oregon State, right? If we're doing a test that's looking at how malt influences beer or different types of malt or maybe a new barley variety or something like that, we're going to present our panelists with a malt flavor map. And that flavor map is essentially like it's a map. You look at it, it's a placemat, and then it has different malt characteristics, malt flavor characteristics, and then different words that mean those things. I'll give you an example. So like sweet, okay? I say the word sweet to you, and you have an idea. You have an impression of what sweet means, right? Question: does sweet mean sugar, or does it mean vanilla for you? Or is there a difference, right?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point, because vanilla isn't inherently sweet, but in desserts, in Western culture, we often pair vanilla with sugar. And so we have this connotation of vanilla being sweet, and when in fact vanilla is vanilla.
Yep, exactly. What about cream, right? Cream. Like a milk cream, like heavy whipping cream, right? Oftentimes we have whipped cream in our desserts, which have sugar added to them. And so that tastes more sweet, but cream has lactose in it. So it's sweet. So you start to like break down some of these terms. And I would encourage you, if you can find one of these flavor maps, I'd encourage you to get one of these for your brewery because they're just really cool to have around and to talk about and to look at different malt flavors. But it breaks everything down. I mean, even malty, right? I mean, that's a flavor that people talk about. Like, I've seen it. I can't tell you how many times I've seen it on a score sheet that says the number one thing that my beer tastes is malty, and it's like, okay, great. That's good because I used malt in it and it's 100% malt beer. But what else is there? You can get down into things like cracker, and this is a good one for like the UK or European folks versus Americans, right? Whenever we talk about cracker and biscuit, that means something totally different to them, right? You talk about graham cracker, and that's something that they've never heard of. Digestive biscuits are the closest thing that I can relate to graham cracker. But you've got all of these different subtleties, and I just wanted to throw that out there as a flavor map because I think that's a really good starting perspective. So when you're thinking about like, okay, I want to brew a Helles, like what flavors are you looking at, Jordan? Like what are you targeting if you're trying to target like a Helles or a light malty beer?
Yeah, so this is definitely a little bit of a blind spot for me as a brewer and a analyzer, I guess, is I'm not great with the descriptors in terms of like with the hop, like, ooh, I'm getting mango or ooh, I'm getting guava. I'm like, wow, this is a really great citrulate, or I'm loving this strata, And so similarly with malt, I'm a little more basic in that like, I know what Pilsner malt tastes like. And I know what, a malty Pilsner malt based beer like a Helles tastes like. But I am not very good at discerning like whether I'm getting more biscuit or light toast or whatever it may be. For me, it's kind of like really Pilsner-y malty, really Cara malty, and I think that Doppelbock, which is often 100% Munich malt, is like somewhere in between caramel and Pilsner. It's not quite the same. And then roasty, of course. And there's various like kind of components of that, whether you're getting more coffee or cocoa or just straight like burnt roast. But I'm not that great with like discerning biscuit versus cracker versus hay or whatever.
So then let me ask you a question. What's your Pilsner malt of choice?
It depends on the style.
Okay.
And so for a Pilsner, a German Pils, even an American IPA, I think standard Weyermann Pilsner is great. Best Malls Pils, good stuff. Idaho Pils by Great Western, love that too. But if I want a really malt forward Pilsner based beer, I really like the Barca Pilsner by Weyermann. It's just way more malty, but I don't think it works that well in like a Pilsner because there's just too much malt character that gets in the way. So that is one of my tricks when it comes to a lot of malt character in a Pilsner-based beer. The Barca line from Weyermann.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to ask. Like, how do you decide? How do you make that decision there? How do you know, like, okay, I want to use Barca in this type of beer, but I want to use Weyermann's just regular base Pils malt in these other types of beers? How do you make that decision?
Well, I mean, I think that first off, you need the understanding and experience of what these different malts bring to the table. So once you have that and you know that the Barca variants just bring more malt character, you got to think about your end goal here and what's the style in question. And honestly, for a Czech Pils, it would probably be a pretty good choice because those are just maltier than a German Pils. Bierstadt, they last I heard, they exclusively use Barca malts, and they're able to get these incredibly dry Pilsner beers, the slow pour Pils, and that malt just gets out of the way. So I think it is possible, but for me at the homebrew scale, it's just there's too much going on with that malt. And so if I want a drier beer, I will choose a different Pilsner variety. I will also add that it seems like the Barca Munich maybe doesn't attenuate as well. And so there is another element there is like the kind of attenuation you could expect from a given malt. If it's going to attenuate less, that might be a better choice for a maltier beer.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we dug into the weeds there a little bit because I was curious about like, okay, if you're looking, let's say, if you're looking at something like a Helles, for example, maybe the Barca malt might be the one to go with, but also it might just be a little bit too malty in those cases. But I was trying to kind of understand, how do you go about picking the right malt? And I guess we should have started at a high level. I kind of just jumped in and went really deep into like, how do you do this for this one style of beer? But we should like pull it back from like a high level. When you're designing a recipe, let's say, for example, it's Oktoberfest, right? And I'm sure you just brewed a Fest beer or a Märzen or something like that. How do you go about like picking which malts should go in that beer? Something that's not just going to be like, okay, 100% base Pilsner malt with, hops in it. Like something where you're actually care about the malt flavor. And hopefully you do this for every beer, that you care about the malt flavor, right? You care about what the malt is contributing in balance to hops and everything else. But how do you decide like which malts that you want to use when you're making something like a Fest beer, Märzen, something that's got more than just a single malt in it?
Yeah, I think there's a few things I'd be thinking about. One is you're looking at an OG, right? So you're shooting for, let's say, 1055 for a Fest beer. You need to add enough malt to hit that, at least in terms of your predicted, OG in your brewing software. But then you're also thinking about color, right? And so for any beer, we're going to select the types of malts that are going to give us the color that we're looking for. Something like Helles, 100% Pilsner malt, or maybe like 95 Pilsner malt and like 5% Carahel, which is a very light, low Lovibond. So you're not adding that much SRM to your beer. So that's really what I'm thinking about, is the OG that I'm trying to achieve, the color I'm trying to achieve, and then within that context, probably the region of the beer I'm trying to recreate. I'm a big believer that you can make the best beers for a given region using the ingredients from that region. So I'm going to try to source German ingredients for a German beer or Czech ingredients for a Czech beer, for example. So I think that thinking about region, color, and then just amount is where I kind of start.
Let me interrupt you real quick there. So why do you think that German ingredients make better German beers? Is there a flavor component to it?
I really think there is. And, we have tested this. In one example, it was a Czech malt, comparing it to Idaho Pils from Great Western, a domestic American malt. And we couldn't taste the difference. Neither I nor tasters could. And I think that really speaks to the quality of the Great Western Idaho Pils in terms of their ability to recreate a European malt. But German lagers from Germany use German malt, and that's like 98% of the ingredients by weight or something. And surely there has to be some sort of like terroir effect in terms of what the resulting beer tastes like. So if you want to make a more authentic recreation, using ingredients from the region is going to help, but it's not enough on its own, right? And it's not like I bought Weyermann Pils, this is going to taste just like Augustiner Helles. You still have to be a good brewer and do everything else right, but it helps get you in the right direction. On the flip side, if you use, Great Western 2-row in a Pilsner beer, it's still going to taste good, but it might not be quite 100% as authentic tasting due to some of these like terroir differences and I guess like malting and, kilning differences as well.
Yeah, for sure. And, I think back at all the Brülosophy experiments where we've looked at different types of base malt, right? Like using Pilsner versus using 2-row in a beer, and it comes back non-significant, right? And I think there is a point to be made there. And I think we've made it on the shows before. And I think Marshall himself has made this as well, which is like, yeah, okay, maybe there are some people that can taste that difference, right? I mean, maybe there are some people that would know that like, yeah, this Weyermann Pils, this was made with Weyermann Pils. And I know it because I know that malt and I know this is what this beer was made with. A lot of people are just going to be like, yeah, it's a malty Helles, right? And it tastes good. And I think that's like you said, that's where like you think a German beer that has German ingredients, like a German Helles, tastes like a German Helles. And that's what you want. And that's where you're trying to go and trying to hit. So you're trying to use those ingredients to hit that specific flavor. Because you could use Briess Pils or Great Western Pils for that example. Not even their Idaho Pils, right? You could use just their regular standard, what do they call it? Premium Pils, is that what it's called? Or something like that? I think that's what it's called. Or you could use Mecca Grades, Pelton, or any of these others, right? And still make a Helles beer. But for you, that flavor that you're trying to target is that authentic German flavor, and that is what you're hitting and going for. So even though we might be able to move freely between base malts in terms of OG or gravity or color, right? That flavor component really is making a lot of decisions for you and for, I think, a lot of brewers out there in the specific grain that they're using for that style or for that beer.
Yeah, and it really goes both ways too, right? So, for example, my local homebrew store here in Portland, FH Steinbart, once gave me a sample of at the time it was new, the RAR North Star Pils. And that had been they'd been really beating that drum, saying that this is a really great, like, kind of Euro style malt. And I made a Helles with it, and it was a fantastic beer, but it really didn't strike me as authentically European tasting in terms of the malt character. And so I think that some of these domestic ones, that'd be a really good choice for like pre-pro Pils or something like that.
Yeah.
On the flip side, you can use Wireman Pils into pre-pro Pils and it's going to be just fine. So it's like, there are some styles where you can kind of go either way and still have a fairly, BJCP authentic example. But then there's others where it's just this little extra nuance that gives you a leg up in maybe competition or just like for the sake of, authenticity. But it's just really, how far do you actually want to go in the name of authenticity, I guess.
Yeah, it's totally true, right? How far do you want to go in the name of authenticity? And I'll use another base malt as an example of something that is one that I really like and that I think needs to be in all English beers, and that's Maris Otter. Like, that's just one of those like intensely characteristic malts. And there are Maris Otter knockoffs, right? Not knockoffs. I'm going to say Maris Otter knockoffs because I really like, the traditional Maris Otters that are floor malted there in the UK. But for example, Admiral Maltings out in California has a great floor malted base malt beer that tastes really good, and it tastes a lot like Maris Otter, right? And so that's one of those that might be good in that particular style. But that's one of those malts that I have to have that malt in the beer if I'm gonna brew that style. And honestly, it's one of the ones I really like to have Maris Otter in my IPAs. I like to just throw a little bit of Maris Otter in because it gives a little bit of like extra malt character to balance that hop. I know you're a big fan of using Pils in your IPAs, but I'm curious, do you occasionally throw in like something like a Munich 10 or something light or like something like a Maris Otter that's got maybe a little bit more character but not a lot of flavor to it in your IPAs as well?
Well, I do not want malt character in my IPAs. So I really am trying to drive as much dryness as I can, and I'll use some sugar to help get those OG points, but also subtract some of those FG points. If I wanted to make like a kind of a Pacific Northwest style, because these days I'm making kind of like San Diego style IPA, I would use a little bit of Munich 10, like 5% or 2% or something like that. I'll often use a little bit of Carahel in a West San Diego style IPA, like 5% or something like that. But another thing I'll do is I'll use like 20% wheat, because I'm drying these things out so much. Dare I say it prevents like an insipid impact. You know what I mean? Like, have you ever had Green Cheek in LA?
No.
Dude, this Evan guy makes these crazy dry West Coast IPAs, and they're really good. But I think he's like using mostly like Pilsner malt and stuff like that. And I find that by adding some wheat, you just get this like hint of a body, even though we can drive that FG down to like, just a Plato or so. Having like 20% wheat in the background there, it just gives you this kind of like, it tricks you into having a little bit more body than is actually there, and it kind of balances out a little bit. Whereas Evan, he is drying these things out to the bone, and it's a really interesting example of like how dry and thin a beer can get, but still be really hop forward. But I find that there is something to be said about a little bit of balancing body, but I'm not talking Midwest IPA with tons of crystal malt and finishing gravities of 10-15. But I do think that a little bit of body can help make the beer less insipid.
Well, that's all right. We've moved away, especially with recent IPA recipes, or at least most of the recent recipes I've seen, away from those caramel malts and crystal malts, right? That was a huge thing back in the late 90s, early 2000s. I think whenever you and I were starting to homebrew, Jordan, we probably saw every IPA recipe had at least 10 to 15% crystal or caramel malt. And that was just, whoa, it was super sweet because everybody thought you had to, balance out the bitterness with this sweetness. And so you put this caramel malt in there. And caramel malt, you've mentioned Cara Hellas a bunch of times. That's a caramel Hellas, right? It's a malt that is germinated. It's steeped and germinated, but when the germination is done, instead of going into a kilning for drying, it goes and gets boiled or put over into the roaster while it's still wet, which essentially boils, crystallizes the sugars, and makes it this crystal caramel malt. And so it adds a huge amount of flavor to it. And depending on how long you roast it in the roaster, you can change the color and flavor. And there's a incredible range of flavor from lightly biscuity, toasty, sort of like sweet bread characteristics, all the way to like raisin, prune, dark fruit, and then even into like coffee and acrid, whenever you get really far off into those dark caramel colors. But caramel malt, Cara Hellas in this case, is not intended to have a huge flavor impact. It's there for generally like body and mouthfeel and foam, right? I mean, maybe a little bit of rounded characteristic, but that's something that's added, at least in my opinion, for those characteristics, those like other ancillary characteristics, body, mouthfeel, foam. That's not to say that caramel malts are bad. I mean, caramel malts are used in a lot of great styles. I think an English mild is going to have some caramel malt in it. Those Scotch beers that we were talking about is going to have some caramel malt. I wouldn't be surprised if a big barley wine had some caramel malts in it. Not because it needs to be cloying or sweet, but because there's a bunch of really nice, interesting flavor characteristics. Like raisin and prune is a really good one that provides a lot of depth in darker styles. In a brown ale, for example, those characteristics are really, really nice. I hear you say about like Carahel. They also have Carapils, and they also have, these lightly kilned caramalts that can be used in that. But I'm here to sing a little bit about some of the caramel malts too. I feel like they've been lost a little bit as we transition away. Although, I mean, we're in the age of the hop, right? We're in the age of the hop and the light lager, and we're not in the age right now of those amber ales or Märtzens that were like the big heyday 5 to 10 years ago, where we were able to use these caramel malts. I'm just saying, don't forget about these malt flavors as we're thinking about brewing.
Well, and I think that it's all style dependent, right? Everything comes back to style. And we've learned that the shelf life on caramel malt beers ain't great. And
yeah.
The interaction of that staling effect in a hoppy beer just doesn't really work very well. That's why, even though New England IPAs might have a high finishing gravity of like 10-20 or something intentionally, they're not using a caramel malt to achieve that, which are notoriously are going to reduce your attenuation due to their like lack of diastatic power.
Well, yeah, they just don't have, the sugar's already been converted. It's converted and crystallized, so
right.
there is no sugar component. It just doesn't get fermented. It's non-fermentable.
Right. So using caramel malts or crystal malts is one way to increase the maltiness of your beer, but also the finishing gravity in the body of your beer. It turns out it doesn't work that well in IPA. And so even in a style like New England IPA, where we're trying to intentionally target a high finishing gravity, they're not using caramel malts in those beers. They're just using base malts and like some simple adjuncts like wheat and oats, and then using other levers like lower attenuating yeasts, higher mash temperatures, etc., because that crystal malt is not going to age well in a New England IPA or a West Coast IPA, in my opinion. And so like when you look at something like a Midwest IPA, if it's super fresh, it's pretty awesome. But the shelf life on those things is nothing, because as soon as that crystal malt starts to turn, that beer's a mess.
This is getting into a topic that we keep coming back to, Jordan, and it's something that I think is super fascinating, but it's the topic of FAN, free amino nitrogen. And I think in a West Coast or in a New England IPA, there's going to be a lot of FAN And I'm wondering if those caramel malts have more of those staling reactions in the presence of high fan beers. I wonder if you controlled the fan, if you might improve the shelf stability of caramel malt. But I digress way past my skis for this. One of the things that you did just mention, Jordan, was there's a lot of different levers that we can use as brewers to use these malts to control with flavor, like mash temperatures, boiling, and all that stuff. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we will talk about some of those processing techniques to help you get the malt flavors that you want.
Established in 1995, More Beer has been consistently serving the greater brewing community since the times IPA was expected to be bitter and clear, and there are reasons they've stuck around so long. In addition to their massive product selection and excellent customer service, More Beer has locations on both the west and the east coast of the United States, which translates into fast shipping times regardless of where you live. And when you spend more than $59, shipping is free. When you're in need of brewing ingredients and gear, there's no better option than morebeer.com, one of the most trusted shops on the planet.
If I'm continuing with the brewers make where yeast makes beer theme, we've decided on the beer that we're going to brew and the malt flavors that we want it to have. We've got the ingredients all set out. We've selected the malts, but we've barely even started scratching the surface of how to get malt flavor into the beer because for the large part, Jordan, right, we have the malts, but what do we do with them? And what you do with them can make all the difference.
Indeed, it can. And I think also the specific malts you choose. So maybe we can start by talking about some of the processes and how that might drive malt character, regardless of the types of malts that you're using. And if time allows, we can talk about ingredients as well. I think that a really classic one that homebrewers think about is mash temperature. What we know is that the higher your mash temperature, the higher the finishing gravity you might expect to see. And so we've done a lot of experiments testing this, and it's one thing that's been really true is that mash temperature has a really dramatic effect on your final gravity. If you mash high, let's say like 160 F, that's like about 70 C or so, that's going to have a way higher finishing gravity if you mashed it like 147 F or 64 C. And in fact, we had an experiment with a English porter testing 147F or 64C versus 163F versus 73C using a decent amount of Maris Otter, some caramel 80, so a little bit of chocolate, and a little bit of brown malt. And it was COVID, so it was just a single taster, but our brewer, Jake, could tell a difference. And he found that, to his palate, the high mash temperature beer actually lacked complexity and had an ashy note, whereas the lower mash temperature had deeper roast and graham cracker flavor that lingered a bit longer. So this is not exactly what I've been expecting in terms of it like affecting complexity. And now I'm kind of wondering how, and this isn't exactly where I thought we were going with this, but how temperature in the mash would relate to the pH, and as it relates to extracting unwanted flavors in darker beers.
Well, yeah, there's the ashy component to it too, but before we get to that ashy component, I mean, your point here, I think what you're making is that, like, you know, we're mashing at a higher temperature for like for higher residual sugars, and that higher residual sugar we would expect would have a cloying finish, right? Or maybe some additional sweetness, or maybe some higher body, or whatever. And so that high mash temperature we would have expected would maybe be more complex, right? Would have more of that body, would have more of that aroma. And here he said it lacked complexity, which was kind of interesting. But I think your ultimate point whenever we're going down this is talking about like how we keep doing experiments on low versus high mash temperature, and we keep finding that yes, there are objective differences in the gravity, but the flavor impact is kind of style dependent maybe, or malt dependent, or there's something else that's going on here, right? And so in this case, yeah, Jake got some like ashy notes, so maybe there was some pH. I mean, he did have caramel malt in here and chocolate and brown malt, so the chocolate malt maybe at a high temperature might have extracted some more of those ashy tannins. I mean, who knows? We'll talk about a little bit, maybe some different steeping techniques for darker malts. But the key here is that there were flavor differences, right, in this, in that low versus high English porter. He thought that the low mash temperature had deeper roast and graham cracker characteristics versus ashy and less complexity in the high mash temperature. But again, like not to lose your point here, because I think it's a very good one, that we did talk about these mash temperature experiments back in the attenuation episode, right? When I talked with Laura Burns and we talked about how to measure attenuation, what it means for the beer, and then we went through a whole bunch of experiments, not just mash temperature, but a lot of experiments going, okay, what was the actual starting gravity and finishing gravity, and were those objectively different when we changed these variables like mash temperature or pH or boil length or any of these other things, regardless of whether there was a flavor difference. And here we see that there's a flavor difference, at least with one taster, but there was an objective attenuation difference. And so there's this, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about, but like last, before the break, is there's this kind of balance of, when I asked you your question, I asked you how do you go about picking your malt, and you said, well, the first thing I look at is there's an OG that I'm targeting, right? And then the second thing is color, and then the third thing is flavor. And you can see that in this experiment, right? That if you were targeting a specific OG, you missed it. If you changed, your malt temperature, your temperature, right? That's an objective metric here. Maybe the color would be the same. I don't know. We didn't do color measurements on this beer particularly, but the flavor was also different, right? So even if you had tried to hit the same OG, if you mashed at different temperatures, the flavor, it might actually come out quite different. So I think that's a really interesting takeaway, and it sort of describes what we're talking about whenever you're trying to hit malt flavor, how mash temperature can play a role.
Yeah, and so when we look at these kind of more holistically and look at several of them, we see a really clear picture in terms of a higher mash temperature consistently produces a beer with a higher finishing gravity. But what's not consistent is tasters' ability to significantly detect a difference between the two when blind. And so we have a low versus high Helles and a low versus high OG Belgian Strong, and in both of those cases, they were not significant. And so what this suggests is that tasters may struggle to tell the difference between various finishing gravities of an otherwise similar beer. And what that means in terms of malt character is maybe mash temperature is not a surefire way to maximize malt flavor if people struggle to tell the difference between a beer with a higher FG and a lower FG.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, maybe it has something to do with the malts themselves too, right? Because I mean, the English porter has those dark malts in it. The Helles doesn't, right? The Helles is just gonna, in that case, it had 90% Pils and 10% Vienna. In the case where it wasn't significant, and then but the high OG Belgian Strong was just one malt. It was just Pils. It was 100% Pils, even though it was to a high OG. It was to 1081 starting gravity. So maybe the malt plays a role there, but talking about like base malts, I think the point is spot on. And I think we talked about this a little bit in the attenuation episode, but I think it's definitely true here that, mash temperature will certainly have an objective impact on your beer. But does it? Is it style dependent, or what is it about it that is like, is it going to have a flavor difference? If I mashed at 160 Fahrenheit, 73 Celsius versus 147 Fahrenheit or 64 Celsius, in that Helles, that was not significant. People didn't tell the difference. So what does that mean? Like, to me, from like a flavor perspective, if I'm finishing at 1008 versus finishing at, whatever, I don't know what the OG was in that one, but probably like 1014 or 1016, something that would be like a full degree Plato different, then tasters weren't able to tell a difference. What does that mean?
I'm guessing there's probably some sort of inflection point, right? That if you're comparing a beer that finished at 0 or 1.0000 versus one that finished at like 1040, surely people would be able to tell the difference. But I think that these fairly minor swings, one Plato in either direction, are not a strong predictor of malt intensity. That being said, if you're trying to drive a sweeter beer, mash higher. And if you're trying to drive a drier beer, mash lower. And if you still want a malt backbone, like maybe a Helles that finishes at 1008, maybe use a Barca Pils. Or maybe use a little bit of Carahel to get some more malty character in there, despite the fact that you're trying to drive attenuation down.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I mean, I think generally that's kind of the rules of thumb that we follow, right? Mash higher if you want a sweeter or heavier body beer. Mash lower if you want a dry beer. And I think that is probably still consistent, right? I think you can still say that even with the experiment results. Although I'll point out, I was looking it up while you were talking, and that Helles that was not significant. The finishing gravity of the high mash temp was 1023, and the finishing gravity of the low mash temp was 1008, right? So that's 15 gravity points. That's almost 4 degrees Plato difference in the finishing gravity in those two beers. So that one is shocking to me, that one did not come back significant. And just so that people don't think we're crazy, there were 33 tasters in that experiment, right? And only 12 got it right, which was not enough for it to be significant. So that was a huge panel, a good sized panel. Like, this isn't, all bad tasters or unexperienced or whatever. I mean, these were real tasters, so all that said, I think the takeaway for this section for mash temperature is that I think you can make drier beers by mashing low, but maybe mash temperature isn't the lever, at least at a homebrew scale, depending on what you're brewing and depending on the style. It may not be like a huge flavor component characteristic, unless you're adding things in like different malts, right? So in the English porter where we added in those dark malts, that could be an issue. And I have an example of an experiment that I did where I looked at steeping, right? So essentially I cold steeped I used midnight wheat in this case, but I made a black IPA, which was 80% pale ale, 15% Munich, and then 5% midnight wheat. And so I took that midnight wheat and put it in about 2 liters of room temperature water overnight, where I just let it stay cold. But the other batch got all of the dark grains at the beginning of the mash. So it mashed the whole time at 140 or 154 Fahrenheit. With the wheat in the mash. So it was hot. And I got a 7 out of 10. That was COVID protocol, so it was just me. And here's what I wrote in the article. I said, while these beers were certainly more similar than they were different, what made them distinguishable to me was the softer roasted character in the cold steep version that resulted in a slight tobacco flavor. I enjoyed both beers, but my preference was for the version where the roasted grains were included in the mash. Which is interesting, right? I would have expected, I wanted a little bit of that harsher characteristic in the black IPA. I didn't want necessarily that softer roasted tobacco flavor in that black IPA. So I think it's using it, maybe there was something to like the acridness or the extraction of some of the dark grains that caused that mash temperature experiment in the English porter to be significant. But long and short, right? There's multiple reasons why you want malt in your beer. One of them is a ABV, a target ABV, and a target OG and FG, right? And so mash temperature will definitely affect that. We showed that in the attenuation episode, and that's been a pretty consistent takeaway. But from flavor, mash temperature is kind of more mixed. What about other things? Are there other components of the process that impact flavor characteristics, Jordan?
Well, maybe we can just nerd out on roasted grains for a second here, because I do think it's a very specific use case, right? And considerations around roasted grains are totally different than base grains or even caramel malts or, adjuncts, right? So in this cold steeped roasted grains example, the theory here is that you're going to get like a smoother roast character, and you don't want as much of the ash acrid in a black IPA because it could clash. And so the theory was if you do a cold steep, you might be able to get just basically the color and maybe more like cocoa notes without some of the roasted burnt stuff. Well, there's a couple other ways you could go about this. You could do a mash cap, and you could add your roasted grains at the end of the mash. I like to do that with my dark lagers, like my Meritzen recipe uses just a little bit at the end to really get that color without having to be too overly reliant on dark Munich malts. My Czech dark lager is the same way. Both of these recipes are available on the website in various experiments that I've done, where I'm adding it just a little bit at the end. And so in these examples, there's even stout brewers that'll cap with their roasted grains, and you'll see that in Gordon Strong's BYO articles. Is he'll often reserve his roasted grains for the end of the mash. The idea being is we're going to get that color while minimizing the extraction of the stuff that we don't want, that's too harsh. And certain styles are going to dictate your approach there. And so that's one recommendation I have, is if you want the color without all of the baggage, maybe save it for the end and maybe rely on these dehusked versions like your Midnight Wheat, which you used in your experiment that you just talked about, as well as dehusked Carafa products. Really great way to get the color and a little bit of roast, depending on the percentage that you use, without getting too much roast for styles that would be out of style otherwise.
Yeah. And as I remember, too, the reason I picked that Midnight Wheat is because I wanted something that was dehusked, right? I didn't want the bitterness. I didn't want the ashy characteristic that is so often happens whenever you use like roasted malts. So I was trying to actively avoid that. And so that's why those results came out the way that they did. I think another thing for dark malts as we're here, and this one applies not just for dark malts, but also for light malts, but in this case, dark malts, since we're talking about it's pH. Right, pH of the mash is going to definitely change what characteristics come out of those dark malts. Right, that ashy characteristic at high pHs is real to me. I've seen that. Like if your pH is just too low, that ashy characteristic comes out. One of my things that I miss the most about Austin Brewing Water in Texas is that it was so hard and the pH was generally so high that I could make a fantastic dark beer and it would taste great. It would never taste ashy. It never tasted acrid or anything, but as soon as I started adjusting the pH on my water, I could never make a good dark beer anymore. And I think it was just because it just would get so that like ashy acridity. So pH definitely plays a role, and whatever compounds are being extracted at that lower pH that makes more ashy and more dark, definitely is a thing for me.
Right, and so a common solution there is pickling lime. They say that chalk can really struggle to get into solution, so that's not really recommended anymore. You can get like a lifetime supply on Amazon for a few bucks, and if you're like me and you make a dark beer, once in a blue moon, it'll last you forever. But that's another reason why some people might want to reserve their roasted grains to the end of the mash, is those roasted grains are going to bring your pH down. And so this way you're not fighting a lower pH through the bulk of the mash when the bulk of that enzymatic activity is happening. You can just add at the end, get the color, get a little bit of a flavor, and not be worried about the pH implications from it being in the main mash. But related to pH is water chemistry. And I think that's another really great way to drive maltiness in beers, at least the perception of maltiness. If you're going to use a water profile that's going to favor more chloride to sulfates, you're going to get a fuller body perception, even if it's not actually impacting the finishing gravity as a function of the brewing salts that you're adding. And it collectively creates the perception of more malt character, whether that's true or not. Now, there are probably some exceptions to that. Like I've heard that when you get into these like really, really, really big barley wines and imperial stouts, there's so much body that's there from the malt and the finishing gravity itself that water chemistry isn't as important. But for standard strength styles, that can be a really good way to drive malt character. So if I'm trying to make a malty lager, I'm going to do maybe like a 2-to-1 chloride to sulfate ratio. And if I want like a dry German Pils, maybe flip that around. And so that's one really easy way to drive the perception of malt character, is just simple brewing water adjustments.
Yeah. I mean, water chemistry, I think, is a huge flavor component in terms of beer in general, and how it influences everything, right? It's going to influence your pH. The water chemistry is going to influence your pH, like we just talked about. Jordan just mentioned brewing salts, and I totally agree. If I'm trying to make a English or like a porter, something that's dark and has nice body, I'm definitely going to favor that chloride over sulfate in that case. But as he mentioned, I found that in my Kolsch. That recipe that I've tried to really hone over the last, I don't know, decade or so, is I generally like a little more sulfate in it, and it just adds this like nice dryness, which I think accentuates that style. So yeah, that's a huge portion of this is water chemistry. One other class of beers that we haven't really spent much time talking about, Jordan, but it also kind of impacts your process and everything, is big malty beers, right? Ones that are high ABV, that have a huge amount of malt in them, and you want malt flavor and aroma. Do you have any tips and tricks for big malty beers?
Yeah, so if you're going to make a really big malty beer, we're talking 12, 15% plus. They say the water to grist ratio you're going to use is however much malt will fit in your malt basket or whatever, plus the rest of the way up with water, So you're not like planning X, liquor to grist ratio. You're just filling that as much malt as you can possibly get in there, and then as much water that will go in without it overflowing. And so what this is going to mean is your yields are going to be terrible, because you have such a thick mash. And so I think that with brew in a bag or brew in a basket all-in-one systems, this is less of a concern, but it still might be a good best practice to go ahead and use some rice hulls, because when you get to mashes that thick and that much, weight and volume in your mash tun, it gets really sticky, and that's a really good way to help that out, is using some rice hulls. So with these big beers, your yield's going to be terrible for a couple reasons. One is that you have so much malt in there. There's just like ton of absorption. So less, wort is going to come out once you lift that mash bag out, or whatever method you're using. So you might want to do a double mash, or just be cool with only making 2 or 3 gallons at a homebrew scale because of that loss. But the other thing is you have an efficiency loss, because it just doesn't scale linearly when you're adding this much weight to your system. So just be prepared for that. So they typically will recommend do not sparge these big beers, because you're just literally watering it down. You want that first runnings only, because that's the thickest, maltiest stuff you can access. And it's just going to take a ton of malt to make any like reasonable amount. But you can save those grains and then do a second runnings beer. So a couple years ago, I did a big imperial stout, and it was like 33 Plato, and I still had to use a little bit of sugar and a little bit of DME. And that was 5 gallons, and I think it took like almost 80 pounds of grains to make that. And I was able to get 10 gallons of like 10 50-second runnings.
Wow.
So there's a lot of sugar left over. But yeah, so that's the other. And then I think when it comes to mash temperature with these big multi beers, 155 or so, you don't need to mash at 165, because your finishing gravity is going to be so high anyway. And then another trick you can do is you can use some DME, because when you're using that much malt, it's not going to taste like a partial mash beer, an extract beer. You can use a little bit of DME to cheat. Another one that I've heard is really popular amongst like the big, imperial stout brewers is brewers crystals. And apparently they provide the OG, but in a attenuation profile that's more similar to malt. It's not fully attenuative like sugar is, and doesn't get in the way and add any sort of weird flavors. It can help you get these really crazy high OGs without like literally breaking your mash tun.
Yeah. You already mentioned the double mash, but the thing I've heard it described as is a polyguile. We talk about party guile, which is what you just described, right? It's taking the first runnings and making your big beer, and then mashing again with the same grains, and then having a smaller beer with that. That's a British party guiling system, because that used to be because of taxes. They got taxed on the size of their mash tun. So just pack the mash tun with grain and make multiple beers from the grains. But I've also heard of polyguiling, which is like what you've said, it's a double mash. It's take the first runnings from your grain, remove the grains, put fresh grains in, and put your runnings, your wort, back on top of it. Let that mash, right? and then strain all that off, and you'll get a lot of sugar out of that because the capacity of the water, there's still a huge amount of sugar that the water can hold in there. The problem is you just can't get enough water and liquid. But if you keep going, you can actually really saturate that liquid and start to make like a syrup out of it by just adding more grains. So something like polygiling. From a flavor perspective, big beers, the big challenge for me from a flavor perspective for big beer is not in the mash tun, and it's not in the choice of malts. It's in the yeast. That's for me where you're going to have the most difference because some yeasts are not going to be able to tolerate that much sugar. Or really, that much alcohol, right, to be able to produce from it. Some yeasts are going to stall out. Some yeasts aren't going to make it. The yeasts that are really good attenuators are going to be super stressed in that environment. So you're going to have to oxygenate and take really, really good care of your yeast. So that's from a flavor perspective. If you want those good malt flavors in a big malty beer, you've got to pay attention to your yeast in that situation. I don't think you can uncouple yeast from malt in that situation. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to mention that.
Yeah, that's why one of the reasons I never brew these big malty beers that frequently is there's so much that goes into it. Like the brew day is a freaking nightmare. The amount of grain and cost of making them is insane. The amount of yeast that you need, the amount of oxygenation you have to do, then the packaging and the barreling. It's a lot of work. But one trick that's often used in these that I think is relevant to malt character specifically, not getting too far into the deep end as relates to like fermentation and packaging and stuff, is boiling. So these big malty beers, they're frequently boiled for like 3 hours is like nothing, like Deal with the Devil by Anchorage Brewing, he'll boil this thing like overnight. And so that's one way to really concentrate malt character is a huge, long boil. I think at the homebrew scale, 2 hours to 4 hours is probably sufficient, especially at our volume. We can get really huge boil-off rates in like a 5-gallon vessel or something like that. And then there's another trick I've heard for Scottish Wee Heavy is you can just caramelize or boil down a portion of your wort in a side pot and add that to your fermenter, so you don't have to do this like crazy 19-hour boil for the whole batch. And so that's one way to get some of that malt complexity without the extended boil for the entire bulk batch.
Yeah. Well, those are good tips and tricks for making big malty beers. I think we also talked about, mash temperature, pH, water chemistry, selection of malts, all of these things that can come together to help you pick and hit those malt targets. I hope we have rejuvenated some of your interest in malty beers. I know this was a fun episode for me talking about. We spent so much time talking about like hops and thiols and all this stuff, but it's fun to hear to go back to malt and talk about malt in all of its beauty.
It really is a beautiful thing, but I think that maybe before we go, we would be remiss to not mention thiols, because we are applying the science of the last episode, and I think that what we've been talking about today is really fundamental historical malt use cases, right? But thiols are a totally different ballgame. And what we heard in this last episode, and I love that you guys uncovered this like mash hop temperature nexus, is that if we are to do a lower mash step and then go on to more of a standard saccharification rest, and we're using a special yeast that can unlock those bound thiols that are exist naturally in malt, you can drive thiols in beer without even worrying about hops. Now, I think that that's an interesting idea. Maybe just make your beer as normal. Don't mash hop, but do this like low step mash approach. Maybe that will give you sufficient thiol character without going overboard and making it a thiol bomb that's not, enjoyable. So I think that there's something really interesting when it comes to malt as a source for thiol. And maybe it's even better than hops. I don't know. But I will say one thing that we're kind of thinking, I guess, based on this study as well, is that there is a relationship between kind of like modification and kilning and the thiol precursor that you can actually extract. So you're probably going to get more from a Pilsner malt than a Munich malt, and you're going to get even more from like a Win malt that goes through an extremely delicate processing that's going to preserve more of that precursor. So these are some things to consider when trying to drive thiols in a beer, and maybe even blending malts might be something to consider there. So do 50% Win malt, 50% standard two-row or something, just to kind of get that balance in play. I think there's still more research to be done to kind of truly crack the code on how to balance thiols the best. But we're learning more and more every day, and I think that was a great study to expose one more way we can get thiols into beer.
Yeah. I mean, so many things to talk about there with Cecile, and so many things that are really cool for the future, right? Like you said, the lower temperature mash, the mash hopping, ways to get this in. It'd be really fun to see if you could make a beer that is thiol based, right? Like you said, using some of these low temperature techniques, maybe using a yeast, not necessarily a thiolized yeast, but yeast that's able to release some of these thiols. And then what would that taste like? What would it taste like if you just just had a beer that was just basically thiols from the malt? Would it be good? Would people want to drink it? Is it a new style that we could consider? Something without hops? Certainly something to consider and think about. And of course, I love pushing the boundaries with malt and flavor. Well, I think, Jordan, we mentioned a lot of different things that the brewers can use to get flavor out of their malts. Is there anything else that we didn't talk about?
I'm sure we'll think of something else for next time.
Yeah, I'm sure we always do. Well, in any event, Jordan and I will be back in 2 weeks with our next Applying the Science episode. See y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brülosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit Brülosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brülosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/Brülosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.
Okay, it's official. We are very much in the final sprint to Election Day. And face it, between debates, polling releases, even court appearances, it can feel exhausting, even impossible to keep up with. I'm Brad Milkey. I'm the host of Start Here, the daily podcast from ABC News. And every morning, my team and I get you caught up on the day's news in a quick, straightforward way that's easy to understand, with just enough context so you can listen, get it, and go on with your day. So, kickstart your morning. Start smart with Start Here and ABC News, because staying informed shouldn't feel overwhelming.